Back in May, I asked a group of 7th grade students to make me a recommended book list of things they wanted me to read. I took their list and picked 3 vastly different books to read over the summer. Welcome back to Espresso Shots and Epic Plots. I'm Genevieve. Today we're going to talk about what happens when you let young adults take over your TBR. Let's jump in and see what surprised me, see why these books might work well for all ages, and hopefully I can give you some crossover or comp titles to read if you're interested. Before I get into these 3 specific books, this trek into YA reading got me interested in what makes young adult different now than when I was a kid. I'm in my early 40s, and I don't remember young adult being a genre when I was a kid. It could be because I just wasn't paying attention, but I did a little bit of research because I was interested. Nowadays, there is a middle grade category. This is your 8 to 12. That's kind of like your 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th grader. Then we have YA or young adult. That is 12 to 18. So really we're getting into 6th, 7th, 8th, all the way up through high school or secondary upper school. And we also have what I think is a new category called new adult or NA. And that's where we have 18 to 25 or 30. The main character of these books are the ages that we find in our novels. Not always, but in general, middle grade main characters are 8 to 12. YA main characters are in the, maybe not necessarily 12, but in the like 14 to 18 area. And then new adult is in the just graduated, maybe a senior in high school. A lot of times they're in college or just graduated from college and they're starting a new job. At those different age ranges, you also find different themes in the book. Middle grade books are about friendship and fitting in and your role in the world. If they're speculative, they might have some light adventure, if you will. Whereas YA books are really getting into identity, first love, a lot more internal, external conflict or internal conflict compared to external realities. And then new adult, which is definitely a new genre in my opinion, is about leaving home, your first steps at independence, figuring out your place in the bigger world, dealing with changes in relationships and friendships, and kind of navigating those big life things that we all had to navigate at some point. So I did a little bit of research on the origin of YA, because new adult is definitely a very new genre. I think it kind of came out naturally with like the delineation of books. I was correct in that young adult wasn't really a thing when I was a young adult. So I would have been a young adult in that 12 to 18 range. It would have been in the early 90s. So the 90s was when I would have been in the prime young adult category. The idea of teenagers as a group didn't even exist until like the 40s and 50s, post World War II. So writing a book about that group of people wouldn't have even been a concept until the 40s and 50s. And that's when we start to see books like The Catcher in the Rye or Lord of the Flies. And we start getting these distinct, this group of people we call teenagers are different. And those are classics. In fact, one of those books is going to come up later when I talk about one of the books that I read. My mom and I previously talked about the book The Outsiders. It was something she had to read in high school. And I mentioned that our students read it in 7th grade. The Outsiders, which was published in the late 60s, was a very new idea. It was actually written by a teenager. I believe that S.E. Hinton was 16 when she wrote it. I think she was 18 when it got published. But this is kind of the quintessential new idea of YA. Previously, we were seeing things like Nancy Drew, which I definitely read when I was in that like 12 to 18 area. And The Outsiders was the first time we stopped looking at teenagers as this group as these like squeaky clean, button up kind of Nancy Drew-like characters and started seeing them in these real messy friendship, relationship, working through gritty portrayals of dynamic interactions. That's why The Outsiders, which I've actually never read, but that's why it is kind of a hallmark of a book. But again, still before my time. I do remember Judy Blume books. Obviously, Judy Blume is what I would consider now like middle grade books. Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, Ramona Quimby, age 8. These are all books that would be considered kind of crossing that trend of middle grade to YA. And we see these in the 70s and 80s. So this would have been my prime reading age. However, they were books you read in school. They were books that your teacher or school library had. Maybe you got them from the library and you took them home and read them, but I don't remember going to a bookstore and buying them. They were in your like Scholastic News that you would take home and you would buy. Again, I could be wrong. My mom might have a better idea of this than I do. But it wasn't until we get into the late 90s and early 2000s that we really see this idea of YA becoming big, specifically in that speculative fantasy sci-fi genre. I remember being in high school and my math teacher not shutting up about this brand new series about Harry Potter. I did not read Harry Potter when I was in high school. I think when I was in high school, when I was reading what would have been YA books, it was a lot of R.L. Stine, Fear Street. That was my genre at the time. That was what I was interested in. That was a serialized book that I probably graduated from Goosebumps to Fear Street, and those were what I would consume. It wasn't until we get Twilight, books like The Hunger Games, which we'll talk about here, that we really see this global epic propulsion of YA books. And that was beyond my time. These are definitely all books I read, but they're books that I read as an adult. My perception of this could be because of my age, and why would I necessarily notice that? But in general, YA is a relatively new phenomenon, this idea of it as a genre. This marketing of it and the consumeristic aspect of it really did not blow up until I was in my late 20s. So when I talk about these books and when I read YA books, I can't really think about what they compared to what I read when I was that age, because I really contend that books that exist today, that quality and style of book, maybe that it's not that it didn't exist, but it wasn't accessible the way it is now. You were told books to read in school, you were given classics to read, but going to a bookstore and to a library and going to the young adult section was not a thing that I remember being available. Based on my research, it wasn't really. They were just integrated in with all of the other books, and you would have to know what you were going and looking for. Obviously, this is my own personal experience. I did do a little bit of research. It was interesting to think about the idea of like a teenager as a concept, but it makes sense that that would have happened in World War II, because you maybe finished school and then you immediately went to work. So you pretty much were an adult in what we would call teenage years. So I can understand this idea of like, as we move away from having young adults working like adults, we have to categorize them as something else. In the modern day, we have these large platforms, things like TikTok, things like YouTube, that are really driving this idea of young adult books versus new adult books versus adult books, and crossing those boundaries so that you can really find yourself in books. Because it's one thing to say this is a young adult or middle grade book, but it's another thing to find a quality one that any age can read. So the 3 books that I picked them for a couple different reasons. One was one that I owned and I had wanted to read anyway, so I was like, okay, check, that's easy. They're all very different genres. They're books that I have heard of or I've heard of the authors, and so I was looking for very different things in each of them. I did not read them back to back. I kind of spread them out throughout the summer. I was surprised and learned things about the current young adult genre while I was reading them. The first student recommendation that I read was Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe. I did not read this book physically. I did listen to this on audio. The audio is done entirely by Lin-Manuel Miranda, which was really cool. I thought he was perfect for the role of our main character. So this book is from 2012, but it is still a very beloved, well-known book that is referenced today. I've heard of it. It has been turned into a movie. There's a screen adaptation for it. There is a sequel to this book written by the same author, but you don't feel like you need to read the sequel after reading this. It's not like this ends with a cliffhanger or anything. This book is about two young boys that are kind of loners for different reasons, and they become friends over a summer in their formative teenage years. I believe they're 14 when the book starts out, and it follows their friendship over the course of, it was about 2 years, it was a year and a half. It was like from the beginning of one summer through another summer and then on to a third summer, if I remember right. I was surprised. Well, number one, I was surprised that my students put this on a recommendation list when at this point, this book is about 15 years old. They were not even born when this book came out. Which is always, don't think about that too hard. This was a very quiet, introspective narrative, a coming of age story. It has a plot, it has action, but it is a very character-driven novel. It is a novel where you are inside of the head of a young teenage boy. You get to hear all of his thoughts that he doesn't really tell anyone. You get to see all of his different relationships with different friend groups progress and change. You see him go through what I think many of us would consider those tough developmental years. It's really interesting to read a book like this as an adult. And well, first off, I just kept thinking, oh, thank God I don't have boys, I have a girl. I think raising a child in general and seeing kids go through these like formative hormonal growth years, like that is what this book is about. And I tried to think about my students reading this book and what a book like this would mean to them. And I feel like it did a good job of capturing all of that angst and emotion that you feel when you're this age. You go in thinking that teenagers nowadays or young adult readers need action and this relentless plot that is constantly engaging you, but here is a book where a quiet, deep, thought-provoking tale can still hook readers in. I'm going to try to recommend comp titles that I have read and I would say definitely would meet up to this bar, but I have a couple that I suspect would also be good comp titles. For Aristotle and Dante Discover the Universe, if this is a book that you enjoyed, The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky is another book that focuses on the emotional dynamics of a small group of friends. In Aristotle and Dante, it's two male friends when they are in the Southwest. Yeah, they're in the like Southwest United States. The Perks of Being a Wallflower is about two boys and a girl and their relationship through around the same time period, actually. So there's a lot of that similar focus of heavy dialogue, emotional dynamics, everything about their interactions with each other. The book that I kept thinking about when I was listening to this was actually The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. I would not recommend The Catcher in the Rye to a 7th grade student, mostly because I don't know that they would understand all the nuances. A high schooler definitely, like a lot of us read that for the first time in high school. If you are looking for a modern day introspective version of an angsty teen who is going through a lot, then the main voice of this book reminded me of the main voice, Holden Caulfield, in The Catcher in the Rye. The plot is not the same. The entire narrative is through one young teenager's voice over the course of time. I would say this one is a little bit more straightforward. This one is definitely more accessible for a younger reading audience than The Catcher in the Rye is. If you liked this, I think you would also like The Catcher in the Rye. Or if you enjoyed The Catcher in the Rye and you want to try something more modern leaning, this would be a good pick for you. Another book or another author, I could say, that I think does a really good job of that emotional gut punch of the coming of age novel would be Rainbow Rowell. I have read and loved Fangirl by Rainbow Rowell. This book, and so far many of the comp titles that I've mentioned are male main characters, whereas Fangirl is a female main character. Fangirl, we have a very introverted, she's actually a twin, she's very different from her twin. They're going off to college and her twin does not want to room with her. Our introverted main character, female main character, all of a sudden has to figure out how to function without heavily relying on her extroverted twin. It was a book that made me sob because of all of the emotional turmoil. There's a little bit of first love in there, but it doesn't really feel like the main point of the book. It's a little bit of finding yourself in a crazy, chaotic world, family dynamics, which is another thing that Ari and Dante are working with in this book. And then I would suspect that Eleanor and Park by Rainbow Rowell also has a lot of the similar dynamics, except with a dual POV of a male and a female character. I haven't actually read Eleanor and Park. Based on a lot of the other works by Rainbow Rowell I have read, she does a really good job of that coming of age emotional voice in books that are really just about everyday life and relationships and people. This was not a book that I think I would have picked up on my own, but I'm definitely glad that I have. Now, if it's referenced, or now if I need to make a recommendation to my students, if they're looking for a coming of age emotional story, then this is one that I could definitely see recommending to them. In a completely different direction. Remember, I told you they were all three very different books. The next one I read was Fake Skating by Lynn Painter. This is a book that I picked because I have actually read some of Lynn Painter's adult romance books. This is a YA romance. I have read other YA romances, especially when I was on a big romance kick. As an adult, I think I would lean more towards what would be new adult romances, not so much YA romances, just because of my age and the time of life and like experiencing love and relationships and things like that. So I don't tend to lean towards YA romances. This is it's not quite a friends to enemies to lovers. It's more of a friends to lovers with a little bit of a separation in between. So we have our two main characters that were friends when they were younger. Their families were friends. The female main character in this, her father is in the military, and so she has to move around a lot. They remain friends up until around, it's like 7th grade. It's like 11, 12, something like that. Something happens and they don't stay in contact with each other. But then when her parents, her military dad and her mom get divorced, her mom moves back home to this small town. She's a senior in high school that is trying to integrate herself into this small hockey Minnesota town and basically reconnect with her male friend who was also like her first crush and her first kiss and all of this stuff. And the story kind of proceeds from there. Obviously, as an adult reading a romance, and honestly, any romance reader, when you are reading a romance book, you want to feel a believable connection between your main characters. You want a plot that makes sense. You want your characters to make choices that make sense. I would say those are kind of like the crux of what you're looking for. Some things that surprised me reading, like I said, I have read other YA romances. They're normally just kind of like meh for me. But something that I do think about when I read YA romances, tropes, like our typical miscommunication related tropes, they make way more sense in the YA romance genre. The idea of emotionally choosing to not talk to somebody makes sense when you're 16, 17, 18, 19. You're not thinking with your whole frontal lobe at this age. The idea of agreeing to fake date somebody, which is a trope in this, obviously, in case you couldn't tell from the title. The idea of fake dating somebody makes sense when you're 17 or 18 to try to hold up those appearances. That is something I could feasibly see children this age, and yes, I'm calling them children, doing. And when I see adults do it in books, I don't think it's very believable, or it's something that I'm just kind of like, okay, sure, whatever, we'll do this for the plot of the story. But it is much more realistic in a YA romance. This was a dual POV, which is something I always like in a romance, especially when we're dealing with conflict, like friends to lovers or enemies to lovers. I like to know what's in everybody's head. Lynn Painter is very, quippy. I think she does a good job of writing adult and YA romances. They feel similar, but obviously in her YA romances, it's much more subdued. We're building up to the kiss instead of other relationship-related things. Lynn Painter does a really good job of executing all of these tropes and miscommunications in a way that feels believable in the YA romance genre. Two other YA romance books that I enjoyed that feel like they have the same sort of like quippy banter, the back and forth communication. I actually can't remember. One of them I think might be dual POV, but don't quote me on it. So my first rec would be Tweet Cute by Emma Lord. I think that might be a dual POV. In this, there are two teenagers that end up in a little bit of a Twitter war, which, now that I say that, Twitter's not even a thing anymore, really. I mean, it is, but we don't call it tweeting or anything like that. But they ended up in a little competitive back and forth on the internet because of their family businesses, and it kind of goes from there. I remember that being really enjoyable, really funny. It's another one of those banter, dual voice things that you get in this Lynn Painter book. And then kind of an out there comp title. I would say this is another recommendation for a YA romance that I thought was genuinely good. Okay, I'm gonna say it wrong because it looks like Sarah. It's I Kissed Shara Wheeler. This is by Casey McQuiston. So Casey McQuiston is known for her adult romance books, but this is in fact a YA romance. There's a little bit of a mystery component, but our main character has randomly been kissed by Shara Wheeler, and then Shara Wheeler goes rogue. She goes missing, and she's a really popular girl in school, and everybody is looking for her, males and females that are looking for her. Our main character is a female that has kissed Shara Wheeler, and she finds out that the same day Shara Wheeler kissed other people, and they're all trying to solve the mystery of where she disappeared to. So it does kind of have like a little bit of that like teenage growth and development, but then there's also a mystery that's keeping you engaged, a little bit of romance. It was a unique YA plot that's not as tropey as you like get in other books. One that I haven't read but I think would be a good comp title would be Check and Mate by Ali Hazelwood. I've read a number of Ali Hazelwood's adult romances, and she does a really good job of, in my opinion, of banter between males and females. She does a really good job of strong female characters. One of the things that I enjoyed about this, our female main character in Fake Skating, Danny, was a strong, independent female. She had a little bit of baggage. Basically, she had moved around a lot, like that's hard for any kid, but that didn't hold her back. She wasn't like a woe is me, I'm gonna fall in a puddle and not make all these choices because I need somebody to help me. She wasn't anything like that. She was not an annoying female main character, because sometimes in YA books, we get these whiny female main characters that are just really hard to stomach, and she was not like that. Similarly, I think Ali Hazelwood does a really good job of writing strong female main characters. I haven't read Check and Mate because, like as I mentioned, this is her YA romance, and I don't read as many YA romances, but based on what I know about how Ali writes other books, I think this would be a good young adult YA romance. If you're looking for adult YA romance comp titles, Lynn Painter has a number that I've read and enjoyed. Ali Hazelwood also has a number. Casey McQuiston also has a lot. YA romances are kind of hard for me to judge. I have to sit and think about them as, are our characters believable? Yes, I thought these were very believable characters. The choices that they made felt believable, especially for their age range. There wasn't anything too crazy or over the top. There was miscommunication that made sense for them at this age and in this time of their lives, and they made choices that I thought made sense for them. I did catch myself smiling, and I was rooting for them. This was very easy to read. It had some good banter. And again, it's not one that I probably would have picked up, but I knew Lynn Painter as an author. And so I always think it's great to see when authors can kind of go back and forth between YA and adult, and they know how to walk that line. Last but certainly not least, the book that I picked out because I owned it and I was always planning on reading it was, of course, Sunrise on the Reaping by Suzanne Collins. Publication-wise, this is book 5 in the Hunger Games series. Chronologically, it's book 1. It's the second prequel. If you are familiar with the Hunger Games series franchise, this is Haymitch's story. This is a pretty recent release. I'm pretty sure I read the Hunger Games shortly after they came out. I was an adult when they came out. So this is a dystopian future United States. There was a rebellion. I want to say people lost, humanity lost is how it feels. That is dystopian. And the world has been broken up into these 12 different factions or districts, and the capital is controlling everything. To keep everybody in line, this is a very utilitarian style, we're going to control everything with might and force. In order to keep everything in line, every year, 2 children from each district, so between the ages of 12 and 18, 2 children, a boy and a girl, are put in a battle, like a death battle. And this is supposed to remind everybody of the sacrifices and terrors of the original rebellion so that it doesn't happen again. That's the entire, it's kind of like the whole franchise. So Suzanne Collins wrote these books fairly far apart from each other. There was the original trilogy that were written pretty close together that follow Katniss and Peeta. Then in the mid-20s, I think it was like the 20-teens, is when she wrote A Ballad of Songbird and Snakes, and that is like a prequel, so it goes way back. And then we kind of get an origin story, and then this book kind of falls somewhere in the middle. So the Hunger Games have developed a little bit, but we're long before we get to the original trilogy to Katniss and Peeta. This is a book about the mentor of Katniss and Peeta. So throughout the original trilogy, they have a mentor who is like the only or one of the only surviving members of District 12, and this book is about his story. It's interesting because if you've read any of the other books, you know what happens in this. I mean, you don't know all of the nitty-gritty details, but you know the ending of a book. And that's always interesting when you read a prequel where you know that our main character is gonna survive and kind of almost how they're going to survive, but you still want to read it anyway. And that's what Suzanne Collins does a really good job of. The pacing, the writing, the drama, the plot, all of that is still there, even 5 books later. The Hunger Games books were in that widening genre of like fantasy and sci-fi books that really kind of established YA. This idea of these dystopian books where we have trials and tribulations. I will say that Suzanne Collins' books are probably some of the more gruesome of the dystopian trials and tribulations. I think we've all read a couple at this point, and a lot of times that's the bar that we hold it up to, is like, how is this like the Hunger Games? She is by no means the only person that has written books like that, but she's the one that we normally go to in our heads. She's the one that got the movies, essentially. There's a manga series, an anime series, that a lot of people say she was inspired by. She claims it was The News, but I haven't read the anime series that's supposed to be similar. I can't remember the name of it right now. So she's by no means the only person that has written books like this or presented children's stories. I shouldn't even say children's, young adult stories like this, but she's the one that people know about. Years later, she still is doing it. I do think that she should probably stop. You know, we have our core duo that we rooted for. We have our origin story that we didn't think we would ever root for. And then this is our other main player in this series. We do revisit a lot of characters that we've seen in the other books. This is kind of a good bridge between the original trilogy and the Zero origin story. And obviously, she could write other books about these other characters. I would fear that at some point it would kind of jump the shark, as they say. It did make me think, you know, when my daughter's a little bit older and she's interested in these, would it be better to read them chronologically or in publication order? Because as I mentioned, you know what's going to happen at the end of this if you read them in publication order. However, reading this one last was kind of depressing. Like, this is a very dystopian, she doesn't shy away from anything. Even the epilogue was not as like uplifting. I mean, and rightly so, like these are terrible, horrific things. This is a very somber end to it. So once I finished it, I was like, oh, I wonder what it would be like to read these chronologically, how different of an experience that would be without knowing anything. So if any of you have read it chronologically, starting with Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes and ending with the Hunger Games trilogy, let me know what that experience was like, because obviously that wasn't an option for me because I had already read all of them. But I do wonder what that would do to how you felt about the books. Anyway, comp titles for this. A decent comp titles, it's another series, the Arc of the Scythe series by Neil Shusterman. That is a dystopian sci-fi series. It's another series that explores the control of people. Mortality is definitely a core theme in that book series, that the burden is placed on young people by corrupt institutions. So young people in that book have to decide who lives and who dies. I would say that book is a little bit more positive on the sci-fi. It's almost like a utopia before it becomes a dystopia. This whole series is very dystopian almost the entire time. I think that's, if you enjoyed these books, I think those would be good YA comp titles. I recently read Red Rising, which just feels like a lot of these other books just feel like they were so heavily inspired by these dystopian trial tribulation, young people surviving and trying to make a difference and not putting up with things. I would not recommend Red Rising to a young reader. It definitely has some older themes. This particular book, there is a lot of song and verse in it. It's very important to the core of it, and that was also present in Red Rising, so I noticed those parallels having read that recently. I know that at some point Red Rising was considered YA. I think it was nominated for like a Goodreads YA. I think the first book, maybe. You'd have to be a very advanced reader to read Red Rising as a 12, 13, 14-year-old. I would probably recommend it to a high schooler before I recommended it to like a middle schooler. So it's a future comp title for any young readers out there. And then if you want a good classic to compare things to, obviously Lord of the Flies is making a comeback right now with I think it was the Netflix adaptation, where again, we have a group of young people that are forced to survive, and this idea that human nature is brutality, which I don't necessarily agree with. I wonder what it would be like as a kid reading The Hunger Games and reading about all of that brutality and how they would treat each other, and then as an adult reading it and actually envisioning these young people having to go through this horrific stuff. It always amazes me how much the adults put up with. I don't think that part's very realistic. Who knows in today's world? First, I have to give a huge thank you to my students for putting these books on my radar. They obviously have really good taste. I look forward to talking about books with them in the next school year. That's one of my favorite things, is when a kid walks in with a book and I'm like, oh, I've read that. Have you read that one? And then we get in conversations about books. But now I want to hand it over to you in the comments. Have you read any of these 3 books? Or what's a young adult book that you've read that you think holds up for adult readers? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. If you're feeling like a silent viewer, and if you want to just leave an emoji, why don't you leave some flames in the comments for Sunrise on the Reaping to let me know that you were here. If you enjoyed this dive into storytelling with some crossover recs, then give this video a thumbs up and subscribe so you don't miss any new videos. I post every Sunday, and until then, happy reading. Okay, so a couple awards. If I had a student that was looking for a recommendation, I always have to know a little bit about somebody if they were looking for a recommendation. If I had somebody that was into like speculative or fantasy sci-fi work, this would be my go-to recommendation. But I've actually found that a lot of students nowadays like real life fiction or historical fiction, in which case I would then recommend Aristotle and Dante. So these would probably be my first go-to recs if a student was looking for a recommendation. Most memorable character, that's a tough one. I'm gonna give it to Aristotle and Dante for that matter. I think Ari more so than Dante for me personally. I did not know what I was going to get into with this book, and there are still aspects of this voice and narrative that I think about. Don't get me wrong, I am a Hey Mitch fan, but I think the characters in this book are memorable because of the deep-rooted, like, this is the 5th book in a series. I've sat with these characters for longer, but when I think about one character impacting me in one single book, it would have to be Ari from this one. So this would be my most memorable character book, which is not what I would have thought at first. The book that young me probably would have obsessed over, that is a tough one because I'm trying to remember. I read I think this would probably have been the closest thing that I would have obsessed over because I was reading, all I remember reading are Fear Street books and mystery books. And this is the closest thing to like a plot with, it's not a mystery by any stretch of the imagination, but a speculative type of plot. These are not books that I probably would have read when I was a young person. I wish I could remember what I read when I was a young person.